on the other one, you bastard!
This video will contain minor spoilers for War for Cybertron, Earthrise. Nothing too far from what was seen in the trailer though, which is kinda every character that cameoed in some sense. Seriously, the trailer did not leave any room for surprise in the show as far as character introductions went. That said, there were many surprising elements with this release, such as the fact that I actually found it somewhat enjoyable. Yes, I am about as shocked as you are. Anyone who's been keeping up with this channel since the previous entry knows that I really disliked Siege. As far as the show itself went, I wouldn't say I hated it, but I did hate what it represented. Siege simply wasn't aiming for the widest audience it possibly could, instead existing in the dead space between full-on fan service and darker reinterpretation to get newer fans on board. The fact that it was plagued with shithouse characters, awful line delivery, disappointing set design, and a propensity to tell, not show, was just the icing on the cake. Unfortunately, this show has taken a turn into precisely the area I was hoping it wouldn't. Earthrise is unashamedly a for-fans show, and if you're not at least a quasi-fan of the franchise, I can guarantee you will not enjoy this. If you haven't at least seen another show, read a comic, or seen one of the movies in this franchise, then I can't see anything here that'll tickle your fancy. But given that my viewer base primarily consists of fans of the franchise, especially since YouTube won't recommend videos that aren't Transformers related, I expect most of the people watching this will have a 50-50 chance of finding enjoyment here. It's far from a great show, but amidst all its flaws, I did find a brief spark of creativity. So how does one go about sorting through the narrative issues to find the diamonds in the rough? Well, all it involves is some simple division.
You are now entering diagnosis. Insanity.
Earthrise's story can pretty easily be split into three main plots. You have what I suppose is the main story, featuring Optimus Prime and his gang of interchangeable G1 references bouncing around the galaxy and encountering a rogues gallery of characters that only exist to sell toys. Then you've got Elita 1's story, where she attempts to retake the remains of Cybertron and hold off the darkness that consumes every angle. And then finally, you surprisingly have a good story with Megatron's arc, where he struggles with his own morality and the path to salvation for the Decepticons who work under him. The latter two is where the story really shines, and it would have been so easy to merge these two stories into one and follow the traditional A-plot, B-plot structure. But no, instead these two stories are given a refreshingly surprising amount of attention, and aren't just good in their own right, but also go a long way into remedying at least a few of the minor issues in Siege. I suppose I should start off with Elita's arc, pertaining to her trying to keep the last remains of the Autobots together in order to stave off the already ongoing apocalypse. Now, one of the main problems with her characterization in Siege, which come to think of it was a pretty consistent issue with almost every character across the board, was that she was given only one emotion, that being teetering on the edge of insanity due to Optimus's incompetence. Aside from one brief moment of levity in the opening episode, every line given to her had the sole purpose of questioning Optimus's honestly dumbfounding decisions. Here, thankfully, she doesn't just demonstrate a wide variety of emotions, thank you for finally writing female characters properly,
My reputation for misogyny is legendary!
but also a competence in her leadership that goes well beyond her superior. If there was one character I was rooting for more than anyone else, it would definitely be her. She's headstrong, but not to the point of being stupid. She second-guesses herself, but not to the point where it blinds her from her conviction. She's wholly open to advice from her teammates, but never lets anything get into ends justify the means territory. This brilliantly contrasts the insurmountable obstacles she has to face, which, without spoiling, has to be one of the most terrifying concepts I have ever seen on Transformers television. Sure, it's wholly outclassed by several of the comic concepts, but I'm not gonna lie, I was genuinely shocked by what they were able to pull. It wasn't due to an over-reliance on edge, it was wholly due to the concept itself and the masterful execution of such. Legitimately, masterful execution is not a descriptor I expected to apply to the sequel of one of the most disappointing pieces of Transformers media in recent memory, but hey, it's a post-Christmas miracle, I guess. And even beyond that, the actual antagonist she gets paired up with is great. In Siege, Shockwave kinda just chilled in the background, dropping hints about his nefarious plans. It was another idea left on the cutting room floor, adding to the pile of frustrations with that show. Here, however, the cold, logical bastard is allowed to truly shine. Granted, he doesn't occupy a lot of scenes over the runtime of the show, but when he's present, you really question whether Megatron's the one truly pulling the strings. His despicable nature is undeniable. He is the perfect opposite to Elita 1. It's one thing to say that any and all empathy has been removed from a character, and it's another thing entirely to actually show the logical conclusion of such a character choice. Ah, logical. How ironic. And before you ask, no, I don't mind his voice. I know there's a vocal minority who consider it to be on the same level as Toad from the Super Mario franchise, but honestly, although different, I think it's fine. I even thought it was fine in the original show. Suffice to say, although the conclusion of this arc has me somewhat concerned with the implications of the eventual Kingdom series, please don't you dare! This was easily the most enjoyable part of the series. Sure, the side characters she's paired with aren't the most charismatic or unique of the bunch, and even provide some of the most cringeworthy lines in this entry.
Autobots, stay alert.
I'm always alert.
Still not as bad as We Are Not the Decepticons from Siege, though. And yes, even Best Boy Jetfire is somewhat inconsistent as the writers struggle to find their footing now that his arc is essentially over.
Are you sure we should be freeing Decepticons? If Megatron's locking up Decepticons, let him. I'm not saying we have to murder them. We just shouldn't risk our sparks and what little resources we have to help them.
Ironic.
But he feels the role of support quite nicely and allows for some nice back and forth between him and Elita. I genuinely found myself invested in this side of the story, despite my frustrations with nearly all of the elements as they were in the previous series. Maybe it's because my expectations were set so absurdly low that even a passable story structure had me excited, but honestly I feel there's genuine heart here, and that's insanely refreshing for a character that often gets sidelined in favor of her typically less interesting successor. Hey, I said typically, doesn't apply to every version of the character. Now Megatron's arc is a little more messy, because if you plot out the story, his kinda crosses over. He starts hanging out with Elita and the crew, engaging in truly appalling acts, and the result of such is that he gets to jump across space and have the one she'll stand nonsense with Optimus Prime, as he normally does. Although this particular arc had its fair share of issues, it still had me on board for most of it. In Siege, Megatron was one of the redeeming factors that kept me watching even through the most sluggish of episodes. You could tell he was committing atrocities out of what he believed was necessity, and he wasn't even aware that he had fallen into tyrannical tendencies. Most of the horrid acts he engaged in were engaged out of circumstance. Given how disappointing the rest of the show was, though, I fully expected them to drop this in favor of
I'm evil just like the G1 cartoon.
But no, they not only continue to build on this interpretation, but I feel they fully realized what they were trying to do in the previous season. I did not expect Earthrise to be the kind of show that would give a full third of an episode to a side story of him personally attending to one of the failing refineries in order to decide whether to shut it off or not. But hey, apparently small moments like these are now commonplace in a show like this. If this sort of attention to detail had been in Siege, I would have been much more forgiving, but hey, it's really good to see it here now. Now, as this story progresses, nothing really comes as a surprise, especially if you've seen the trailer, but those opening episodes really help set up this character to a greater extent than any element present in Siege. As far as the first half of the story is concerned, there's not really much I can complain about. When we get to the second half, though, it takes a massive dip in quality. It never gets to the point of being wholly unwatchable, but it's still a frustrating situation. You'll recall earlier that I described Megatron's shift between two separate story arcs. Well, just by being within close proximity to Optimus Prime, his story gets lowered in quality drastically. Granted, it also raised the quality of Optimus Prime's arc, bringing both to a kind of midpoint, but ultimately it's disappointing to see everything built up in the first arc go to waste. There are elements I like, such as the philosophical back and forth between the two in episode 4. A broken clock is right twice a day, and Brandon Easton's overbearing, verbosely grandiose dialogue for once actually suits the tone here. I feel this scene would have been far more effective if there had been more build-up to this point in Siege, but it does a lot of heavy lifting in an attempt to fix the characterization that was squandered before. See, Siege had the problem of being too robotic. Now, to a lot of people that seems somewhat confusing. The tagline for a lot of the time is literally robots in disguise. However, technically the Transformers aren't robots. They may be in the colloquial sense, but in the technical sense of the word, they really aren't. What makes the Transformers series so engaging is the characters behind the plastic. It's part of the reason why the franchise has endured for so many years, more so than any other franchise in the 80s that just slapped stereotypical personalities onto existing toy designs. Even as far as Generation 1 was concerned, you still got a feel for their wants, their faults, their history. They aren't just machines, they have souls. One of the things that I was really disappointed with, as far as Siege went, was the sheer lack of emotion for most of the cast. They didn't react to things, they merely carried out actions in order to move the plot along. This is why this scene in particular, as well as the majority of Megatron's arc and the entirety of Elita's, works so much better in comparison to anything from Siege. For once, we're actually getting inside the heads of these characters. This is the Transformers franchise at its core. Sure, a lot of it is toy collecting, but that's in no small part tied to the strength of its characters. Unfortunately, some of that clunky plot progression does end up infecting Megatron's story. If you've seen the trailer, you'll know that Galvatron makes some sort of appearance. Well, without getting into too much detail, you want to see how that turns out? Hi there!
Who the f*** are you?
Oh, I'm a Marvel Comics reference, brew.
What?
You've got to use your mind powers, man.
I'm sorry. What?
Hurry up, brew. I haven't got all day.
Fine.
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
Awesome. Wait, sorry, mate. Gotta go. That's all the time I have. Catch you later in a non-transforming, non-toy accurate body.
Hey, yo, what the fuck?
Suffice to say, Galvatron's inclusion is purely set up for Kingdom. Nothing more, nothing less. In total, I'd say he's in the show for about 5 minutes on and off. It's roughly Gareth Edwards' Godzilla levels of screen time. For the most part, though, this remains pretty scaled back for Megatron's story. No, most cases of this character ham-fisting is placed in Optimus Prime's arc, and oh boy, this is where most of the issues with the series take form. Out of the 3 arcs in this show, this one felt the most pointless. It contains the most bloat, the least character progression, and the most advertising. Like, I understand this is primarily made to sell toys, but what they do here is some of the most excessive advertising I've ever seen. First up, much like Megatron bumping into Galvatron, Prime gets shoved into a lot of setup scenarios. Yeah, remember that one shot of Nemesis Prime from the trailer? That's the only time you see him. And that's not the only Generation Select homage you'll see for like 2 seconds. Oh no, I won't give away which one it is, but you can probably guess. I'll give you a hint. Dead parrots. And then beyond the setup, 2/3 of the story basically revolves around turning up to a new location, meeting a new character with a toy on the market, and then that character becomes irrelevant for most of the story. Double Dealer's characterization is honestly the worst. They're trying to make him this duplicitous bastard, but since he isn't in the story for enough time, you don't get to see any of his actions, let alone understand the reasons for why he's doing what he does. He affects the plot so little you could practically cut him out of the story and nothing would change. It literally gets to the point where one of the characters explains that something is his fault out of nowhere with no explanation. Guess the animators couldn't be bothered animating him entering a few more Zoom calls. Then the Quintessons, Quintesson, yeah, they clearly couldn't be bothered animating multiple Quintessons, so they only gave us one. At the start, they seem really intimidating. The flip face that we've all seen done before is done incredibly creepily, perhaps more so than the Cyberverse version. But then, not only does she, and yes, I switched the pronouns for a reason, get ditched from the story until the last act with no connection to the story aside from huzzah, I'm here to f your shit up. But I shit you not, they do one of the most insulting things to the character you could possibly do. You don't even have to be a fan of the Transformers franchise to be pissed off at this. The difference between how they were introduced and how she ends up at the end of the series is so stupid that I'd put it on the same level as most of the dumb decisions in the Prime Wars trilogy. If I had to take a guess, it's probably because they couldn't progress the plot with them in their current state, but Jesus Christ, they basically took the only bit of characterization they had and squandered it. Once again, cut her out of the story and nothing changes. Scorponok is roughly the same, part boss fight, part shameless attempt at tying in the useless Quintesson arc. Fortunately, the size difference isn't actually that big of an issue. He still remains a pretty neat threat, even if the voice acting does everything in its power to make him seem less threatening.
Looters shall be punished.
Beep. Boop, I am a robot.
You can tell they didn't have the budget to make him transform on screen, but at least he is a memorable set piece, even if like the other shoehorned characters, you could easily remove him and nothing would change. Point is, you could easily streamline the story by cutting these bits out entirely. It's basically the equivalent of Canto Bight in Star Wars. Without it, The Last Jedi would probably be a awesome film, but it just acts as not only deadweight story, but also perfects the recipe of cringeworthy concepts. I do get why these characters were forced in. I far from agree with the ridiculous reasoning, but I do understand where the producers were coming from. This series is, by and large, meant to sell toys, and the only way to do that is to give them a spotlight in the show. For most people, toys aren't worth buying unless they have a connection to the character. It's just good marketing. Here's the thing, though. You want to know the best method for selling toys? Give them good stories! If a show doesn't give you enough of a reason to care about these characters, then people won't buy your toys. Take a look at the primary issues. Breakdown was never given a Western release, and people have been clamoring for one for years because, of course, his presence in the show was deeply engaging. Now take Optimus X Prime. Does anyone care about Optimus X Prime? No. Why? Because no one wants Transformers Go! To be fair though, that's probably for the best, but the point is that without a connection to the character on screen, toys aren't going to sell in the quantities you want them to. Following the release of the Siege season, Hasbro reissued Jetfire, but not Omega Supreme, and I think the reason there was a demand for the former but not the latter is very clear. Jetfire is a character with desires of his own, and a reason to get invested in him, even amongst the show that was War for Cybertron Siege. Omega Supreme is a set piece who shows up in the last 5 minutes to have a big fight scene at the end. Beyond that, both Netflix Elita 1 and Megatron have seen massive sales across the board based on their performance in the show, and now that Earthrise is out, requests on social media for these have been rampant. Why is this? Because they were given full proper arcs in the show with time to develop. I wouldn't be surprised if Shockwave suddenly rose to popularity after all this time too, because as stated earlier, good stories sell toys. Do you think anyone's gonna give a f about Double Dealer, the Quintessons, or Scorponok? Well, maybe they will about Scorponok, but as far as the first two are concerned, I can't see people jumping on these. In the quest to sell more toys, they've likely ended up selling less thanks to this kerfuffle. And between Between all the plastic crack sightseeing, Optimus Prime continues to be the absolute worst incarnation I've ever come across. This time, it's less due to the voice acting. Yes, it's still pretty bad, but at this point I've gotten used to it. No, at this stage, they've finally taken a clear stance about what this character is about. In Siege, Prime kind of flopped between headstrong leader and whiny fool, and this time they've actually managed to make sense of it. He is, to put it bluntly, a whinging teenager, and I hate it. He's okay for the first part. You can tell he heavily carries the guilt of basically the genocide of his home planet. As the story progressed, though, it essentially devolves into stupid decisions and constant whining. There's literally a scene in the final battle where he begs Megatron for forgiveness, and it gives you so much tonal whiplash that it fully breaks the immersion of the story. This scene alone pushed this version of Optimus Prime into the position of absolutely worst I've come across in the franchise. When you combine the poor level of voice acting, inconsistency of the character, and sheer cringe factor, when they finally do make him consistent, you get a rendition that's honestly worse than Cyber Missions, and that version didn't even have any characterization. The thing is, they've done this whole guilty Optimus thing way better in the past, and recently too. Cyberverse managed to pull off this story quite well in its first and second seasons, and despite having the same voice actor, manages to give much more characterization to Prime. This feels like a wholly unique and memorable take, whereas Earthrise Prime, well, he's memorable but is not categorically good. And if that wasn't bad enough, as stated earlier, just by being in his proximity, Megatron loses all consistency as well. And yes, they do try to make them truly memorable, like the aforementioned scene where they discuss the philosophy of war, but watching it a second time honestly gives you the feeling that this scene barely turned out as good as it did, and any misstep from Optimus Prime would have ruined the entire thing. All of this culminates in the worst part of the show, and it really feels like all of the good elements worked in spite of this core. It's clear that the Optimus Prime storyline is meant to be the narrative center, but it really only takes up a third of the runtime in the first half of the season. Even towards the end, it's only 40% of everything going on. You're still dealing with the escapades of Elita 1 and the treacherous antics of Starscream, leaving roughly 40% for Prime's story. Had it been a true 50-50 split, this show would have been wholly unwatchable, but thanks to the coincidental narrative imbalance, it surprisingly works alright. I truly believe this wasn't intentional, that Megatron and Elita's stories were meant to be brief side missions that accidentally got fleshed out more than they needed to. This is one of those cases where I'm glad the side content derailed the main quest, and I give massive props to this probable fuck-up, as it, on its own, likely saved the series for me. Well, that and one other point. Now, there's not a lot of discussion surrounding this series, since A, it's only made for fans and not newcomers, and B, many of the fans have already fallen off after Siege. However, amongst the few that have been brave enough to venture into this uncharted territory, Episode 5 remains the greatest point of contention. I won't go into detail about what actually happens, but the story slows down and allows Optimus Prime to truly process the weight of the actions he's committed. It echoes the introspective moments from the IDW comics, and although it doesn't quite carry the same gravitas, I personally found it to be the best episode the series had done. I was watching it with a mate though, and he personally hated the thing. Coincidentally, he's the same mate who gave me the idea to change the articulation segments in my reviews, but that's beside the point. The point is, you're either going to love or hate this episode. It's either going to elevate this show into a flawed but surprisingly enjoyable time, or plunge it into the bottom of the barrel as one of the worst shows the franchise has ever put out. I can't even begin to hypothesize what kind of person would like this episode over what kind wouldn't. There's no consistency whatsoever. Without a doubt, this has to be one of the most controversial episodes the franchise has seen in recent memory, with immensely polarizing opinions. I can guess why I liked it so much. 2020 has been an awful year for me. I've had to engage in a long series of counseling sessions to overcome clinical anxiety and an inferiority complex. That comes from years and years of familial verbal abuse and emotional neglect, and something about Prime being told that it's okay to feel the way he does, and that the hurting is natural, that the healing process takes time, with the process being engaged one step at a time. It honestly spoke to me. Or maybe once again my expectations from how awful Siege was were set so low that something like this blew me away, but even after reflecting and rewatching this episode, I legitimately think it's the most mature part of the series. Would this episode have worked infinitely better if they had given it better setup in the first half than the previous series? Definitely, but even in a vacuum, there are concepts at play here that I haven't seen in this franchise since IDW, and flat out haven't seen handled this well in a Transformers television production. But that's my take on it, and honestly, as said earlier, I cannot even begin to guess what your opinion will be. There are great elements in this series, but the few flaws it holds on to are incredibly difficult to overlook, and ultimately it leads to an experience that all hinges on how you find the 5th episode. All I can really say is that you really should watch it for yourself and make your own decision, wholly separate from my analysis, if you even can call this video that. You don't really need to see Siege before watching this. As long as you've engaged in at least one form of Transformers media, there's nothing here that will have you confused. Look, there's not a whole lot to analyze about this series. Most of my greater complaints have already been exhausted throughout the production of the Siege review. This show is good, but melancholically so. It will sadly never be the show that I wanted it to be, and I don't mean in the sense of tone, art style, or level of fan service. I wanted this show to be a bold new take that brought in a plethora plethora of new fans, and I genuinely believe that is still what the franchise needs, even if very few people agree with me. This series is not that. It will never be that. It has found its footing in precisely the opposite area of what I wanted it to do. But that's okay. It is still enjoyable for the most part, and who knows? For the first time in years, I honestly don't know the path this franchise will take. When Siege first came out, I was sure that we were on a downhill trend that needed to be stopped. Granted, I have immense concerns for the upcoming Kingdom series. With the amount of characters that need to be introduced due to the ridiculous levels of foreshadowing in Earthrise, it seems almost impossible to tell a truly coherent story for the final season. I honestly think it's going to be a mess, but beyond that, who knows? Cyberverse has been graced with 2 more TV specials, allowing them to tie up the remaining loose ends and deliver a solid conclusion. Its accompanying game, Battlegrounds, surprised me with how fun it was. Not something you absolutely have to play as a Transformers fan, but definitely an enjoyable advertisement for the greater Cyberverse franchise. The Beast Wars film may have kicked the bucket, but Bumblebee 2 is on the horizon, hopefully paving the way for the future of the Transformers cinematic universe, if that ever exists. It could, but it might not. But I'm remaining optimistic, and we still have no idea which media will follow Cyberverse, and when it ends, War for Cybertron. Maybe it's only because 2020 has finally f***ed off, but for the first time in a long time, that sense of dread towards the future of this franchise is receding. Until then, though, all I can do is hope that they continue this upward trend with this trilogy. Although it remains unlikely, maybe, just maybe, this show will unearth more diamonds in the rough. You don't get 2 first impressions, and this show will never have the impact I wanted it to have. But who knows? Maybe it'll be well worth the ride after all.